illallah Muhammad Rasulullah.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin khatamil anbiya'i wal mursaleen. Salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi wa alayhim ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. Allahumma 'allimna ma yanfa'una wanfa'na bima 'allamtana wa zidna 'ilma. آمين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بكم. I welcome you back to our course on Imam al-Hadrami's Safinat Al-Naja, covering ibadat from a Shafi'i primer. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala, we commence with the course with our course outcomes clearly spelled out to introduce students to Islamic law as the first step into the legacy of the Shafi'i school, and to learn the 5 pillars of Islam at a beginner level, bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. And of course, we have courses for every other level, bi-idhnillah, as you proceed along this trajectory. In this lesson, our outcomes is to cover the following. Number 1, the 10 conditions of ablution, or wudu as it is called in Arabic. To cover the 4 nullifiers of ablution, in other words, those matters that would break one's wudu. And to cover the forbidden actions within various states of impurity, such as when one does not have wudu, when one does not have a ghusl, etc. So we commence. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم مفتاح الجنة الصلاة ومفتاح الصلاة الطهور. Allah Ta'ala has placed keys for everything necessary, and they open up the way. So Allah made purification the key for prayer. As the Messenger ﷺ said, the key to prayer is the purification or the processes of purification, bi-idhnillah. So this is our text for our lesson here today, bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. And the text reads as follows. Faslun fi shara'it al-wudu, a chapter regarding the conditions of wudu. Now it is important that as we approach fiqh, we don't only learn the subject matter at hand, but also as a general application to understand the technicalities of fiqh, the way that the scholars generally deal with a particular subject. Some of these trends that you may find as you study and as you increase in knowledge in the science is that we would generally start off with a definition. So for example, the definition of wudu, the definition of a ghusl, and then proceed to discuss 3 important aspects of that particular ibadah. The one would be the conditions or shurut, also shara'it, and then it would be the arkan, right, plural of rukn, which means the integrals, those pillars of that particular act of ibadah, and then finally the sunan, which are the supererogatory acts, those acts which beautify and adorn that ibadah, but it is not essential for the validity of that ibadah as we proceed. So this is the structure that you find in fiqh from the very foundational levels all the way up to the more advanced studies of fiqh and the kutub for that reason. So we proceed in this chapter, inshallah, we're dealing with shurut. So for the 3 that we've mentioned, we said shurut, arkan and sunan. This deals with shurut. Shurutul wudu'i asharatun. The shurut or the conditions of wudu, of ablution as it is translated, asharatun, are 10. There are 10 conditions for the ablution of Islam. Firstly, al-Islamu, it is to be Muslim, right? Wudu will not be valid if somebody is not Muslim. Now, sometimes the scholars mention this specifically, and other times it is kind of understood because ibadah in general would not be valid without Islam. Sorry about that. Then secondly, what tamyiz, right? Tamyiz. What is tamyiz? Tamyiz means the age of distinction. The age of distinction has broadly been defined as that age in which a child is able to clean himself or herself, that age where he or she is able to eat by themselves, dress by themselves, and importantly, be able to distinguish between right and wrong, good and bad. Not that they always comply, but that they understand the difference between that. There is no specific age that has been identified as a definitive point of tamyiz. However, many scholars had looked at the age of about 6 or 7 lunar years, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Then, وَالنَّقَاءُ عَنِ الْحَيْضِ وَالنِّفَاسِ. Another condition of the ablution is that the person performing ablution, or the mutawaddi', that's the name of the person performing ablution, that they be free or clean anil hayd, from menstruation, one nifas, and from postpartum or postnatal bleeding. Right? So if somebody has postpartum or postnatal bleeding, then their wudu would not be valid, even if they were to perform a wudu. وَعَمَّا يَمْنَعُ وُصُولَ الْمَاءِ إِلَى الْبَشَرَةِ. And they also need to be free, amma, from that which يَمْنَعُ would prevent وُصُولَ الْمَاءِ, the reaching of the water, إِلَى الْبَشَرَةِ, to the skin. Now, we will add notes to this as we proceed, bi'idhnillah, but some obvious examples come to mind. In cosmetics, sometimes people use certain types of cosmetics that have a non-penetrative barrier, or they are insoluble, so they don't mix with water. Water cannot penetrate that particular barrier. Nail polish, right? Certain types of makeup, they form a sort of a barrier on the skin. They don't mix with the water, so they need to be removed before one can actually have wudu, because the water won't reach the skin, which is a necessary condition of the wudu. So that forms a shart. وَأَلَّا يَكُونَ عَلَى الْعُضْوِ مَا يُغَيِّرُ الْمَاءِ. There should not be on the limb of wudu that which would change the water. So in previous lessons, I think it was in the last lesson actually, we dealt with what happens if you have water, plain water, clean water, natural water, and then you add something pure to that water. So for example, you add some coffee granules, you add some concentrated juice, just a few droplets, where it doesn't actually change the water, but you know that there's something added to it. Does this affect the water? No, this would still be considered pure, this would still be considered clean and have the ability to clean. But when water is changed to that point where it has an apparent change in the color, taste or smell, again we are speaking about a pure substance here. A good example of this may be certain types of lotions. So if you apply a thick lotion onto the skin and then you were to wash your hands, you would notice that the water coming off of your hands is no longer really water. That if you collect that water, it would look murky, it would smell different, and it would taste different if you were to taste it. So this would be a mixture of water that is not considered to be water. If you suffice yourself with a wudu, with an ablution, only with that water, then that is not going to be sufficient for ablution, because it is not water in its natural state. So this particular shart is saying that وَأَلَّا يَكُونَ عَلَى الْعُدْوِ, that there should not be on the limb of ablution مَا يُغَيِّرُ الْمَاءِ, that which would change the state of the water. So if somebody has some thick lotion or the like on their limbs, they should ideally rinse that off, right, to the best of their ability, at least to the point where if they were to apply fresh water onto that limb, it would remain fairly clean. It would remain what we would still term as water, right? There's no apparent change in relation to that. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. Then the next condition, وَالْعِلْمُ بِفَرْضِيَّتِهِ. It is necessary to have knowledge that the ablution is obligatory. So you need to know that it is obligatory, right? And you need to know which elements of the wudu are obligatory, which goes into the next point, وَأَلَّا يَعْتَقِدَ, وَأَلَّا, and that should not, يَعْتَقِدَ, you should not believe, فَرْضًا مِنْ فُرُوضِهِ sunnah. You should not believe that one of the obligatory elements of the wudu is actually a sunnah. So to demonstrate this, if somebody washes their face, but they believe that the washing of the face in the wudu is sunnah as opposed to being fard, this would be a break in the shurut, in the conditions of the ablution. So somebody needs to have knowledge, of course, to know which elements of the ablution are obligatory and which are not. And of course, we've dealt with the 6 obligatory elements of wudu in a previous lesson. Bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, we can revise that if you so need to, and we proceed. وَالْمَاءُ الطَّهُورُ And another condition for the water, for the wudu, is that the water be tahur, right, purifying. What's the difference between tahur and tahir? You may have heard the term tahir before. Tahur may be somewhat new. Tahur is on a scale of hyperbole, right? Hyperbole means that it's not just ordinary, the ordinary form of the particular word, but it is a hyperbolic form. The word exaggerated is sometimes used, although exaggerated means that you are enlarging something or magnifying something beyond what it actually deserves to be magnified. Whereas a scale of hyperbole more indicates towards an actual magnification. So if tahir means something that is pure, then tahur would, for example, mean that it is not only pure in and of itself, but it also has the ability to purify others. It has the ability to purify something else. So in Islam, when we speak about al-ma'u tahur, purifying water, as it is often translated, it means that the water is clean and you can also utilize it for cleanliness. You can utilize it for wudu, for istinja, for ghusl and the like. So what would be examples of pure water, purifying water rather? Ma'u tahur is water in its natural state, right? So unchanged water, plain water, water that you can drink, you can use it. It looks like water, tastes like water, it smells like water. You don't need to add any other descriptions to the water in order to be truthful when you call it water. Right? That's essentially water in its natural state. Pure water, on the other hand, ma'u tahir, right? Pure water is water that would still be categorized as clean, meaning it is not contaminated water. It has not been contaminated by najasa, by filth. So if it gets onto your person, onto your clothing, your person, your place, there's no need to wash that off because it's not dirty. But at the same time, it doesn't possess the ability to cleanse for the purposes of ritual worship. So you cannot use it for istinja, you cannot use it for wudu, and you cannot use it for ghusl. We've referred to this before. I mentioned that this is sometimes referred to as grey water. It's sometimes referred to as used water. But essentially it means that either the water was changed due to some pure substance that was added to it, that you can no longer call it water, or the water was actually utilized for an act of worship previously. So somebody performed wudu with some water, they then collected the water that dripped off their limbs, and they now have this extra water available, right? It's referred to as grey water sometimes. That water is used water. Now used water is clean, so it's not najasa, but you cannot use it for wudu again. So this condition is stating that it is essential as a condition of the ablution that we utilize purifying water and not just pure water, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. The next point says وَدُخُولُ الْوَقْتِ, right, that the time must have entered. Now this is specific. This is specific to what is going to be mentioned now. دُخُولُ الْوَقْتِ, the time of the prayer must have entered. وَالْمُوَالَاتُ, as well as quick succession. لِدَائِمِ الْحَدَثِ, for the person who is in a perpetual state of non-ablution. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests us in different ways. Sometimes He tests us with regards to our health. May Allah grant us all good health. So there are various conditions, such as incontinence, for example, where somebody uses the bathroom, they relieve themselves, and after they relieve themselves, there's still some dripping of urine that comes from their private parts. Another example of this would be flatulence, right? Somebody has the constant passing of wind that is sort of uncontrollable. And then another example of this would be istihada, right? A lady with what is sometimes referred to as chronic vaginal bleeding in fiqh terms, but it essentially means that she's got a hayd that is beyond the limits of the legally categorized hayd or the legally categorized menstruation cycle according to fiqh. She's gone beyond those limits, which is basically 15 days in the Shafi'i school. So she's bleeding for longer than 15 days. You no longer consider that as hayd, but rather as istihada, or a chronic form of bleeding. In all of these instances, the individual technically doesn't have wudu. So they're always in a state of non-wudu, right? This is what is referred to as da'imil hadath. Da'imul hadath is somebody who is in a perpetual state of hadath. Hadath means a state of non-ablution. So for this individual, a person suffering from incontinence, flatulence and the like, the way they prepare for wudu is to, number one, wait for the waqt to enter. So dukhulul waqt. They cannot perform an ablution before the entry of that specific waqt, right? So let's say the waqt in question is Salatul Asr. They cannot prepare for Salatul Asr an hour in advance, an hour before the waqt has entered, and then wait for the waqt and then basically just perform the salah with their existing ablution. It wouldn't be valid for them. For a person with this condition, first thing is they need to wait for the adhan, for the waqt to have entered, and then proceed to prepare for the ablution. And then the second issue that they also need to be conscious of is وَالْمُوَالَاةُ لِدَائِمِ الْحَدَثِ, succession. That while under normal circumstances, if you do not wash the limbs of ablution in succession, there wouldn't be any problem with your ablution. But if you are in a state of da'im al-hadath or perpetual non-ablution, then you cannot take breaks in between the limbs. So a person not afflicted by this, what we may call a normal person, that person is going to be performing ablution, and if they are interrupted or they take a break in between, let's say they wash their face, their arms, and then suddenly somebody calls them for an emergency and they turn around and they speak to that person for about 5 minutes. When they turn back around, if they didn't do anything to break a wudu, then they simply continue from where they left off. So they wash their face, their arms, so they proceed to their head, their ears, and then their feet. But for a person who is in a state of da'imul hadath, perpetual non-ablution, he or she cannot take any sort of breaks or interruptions between the succession of each limb. Nor can they delay after preparing for that particular salah to go and perform that salah, except for the necessities, such as waiting for the jama'ah to begin or walking to the masjid or something of the sort. These are conditions, of course, that are specific to this type of situation, da'imul hadath. And then there are some other considerations as well, right? That's not particularly related to this dars, but we will mention them as well. So what should a person in a state of perpetual non-ablution do? A person in a state of perpetual non-ablution would clean themselves when the waqt enters. They would clean themselves to an extent where they take precautions of filth or any sort of najasat that would be coming from their person after they perform their ablution. So somebody with incontinence wouldn't only make istinja, but they would also apply some sort of sanitary toweling so as to absorb whatever najasat comes from the private parts, so that it doesn't contaminate the clothing in the place of salah and the like. They take that step, then they perform their ablution, and then they immediately proceed to the fard prayer, and they perform that one obligatory prayer with that ablution, and they can pray as many sunan as they so desire along with that single ablution. But when the next obligatory prayer enters, they would then need to renew their ablution in the same manner that we've just described, and this applies to anyone in a state of perpetual non-ablution or da'imul hadath. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. So there are some notes about this. We will go through the English translation as well as the notes as we proceed. This section deals with the conditions of wudu. The conditions of wudu are 10. Footnote number 28. The conditions for the validity of ablution. These conditions are also applied for a ritual bath. So the same conditions that we have been discussing now and that we are repeating here, they also apply for a ghusl. So the same shurut of a wudu apply to a ghusl as well. Islam, we mentioned that. Number 2, the age of understanding. The footnote is basically just going to reiterate what I already said. What exactly is the age of understanding? So you have a note within your notes about that, about tamyiz. So you can also go back to that and memorize it, inshallah. Number 3, cleanliness from menstruation and postnatal bleeding. Okay. Number 4, being free from that which prevents the water from reaching the skin. And I've given the example of nail polish and certain cosmetics that do not have penetrative barriers, or rather that have non-penetrative barriers. And then number 5, nothing should be upon the limb that will change the qualities of the water. The example that I gave was certain types of lotion. Number 6, the knowledge of it, the wudu being obligatory. So one must know that this is an obligatory act. Number 7, not to assume the obligatory acts as being sunnah or recommended. Footnote number 30 says, for the general public, it suffices to know some of its acts are fard and some are sunnah. Right, so the concern may arise that, look, a student of knowledge may know that the face, the arms, the head and the feet, those are the obligatory limbs to be washed, and then the tartib and the niyyah. But somebody who is not a formal student of knowledge, still being mukallaf, being duty bound, as long as they know that there are elements in the ablution that are obligatory and other elements that are sunnah, then that too would suffice for the layman, though everybody would be responsible to ensure that they are constantly learning so as to not miss out that which is obligatory for them, and Allah knows best. Then number 8 we said is pure water, and we've explained that this means purifying water, right? There's a difference between tahur and tahir. Number 9 and 10, special conditions for those who are in a perpetual state of non-ablution. It says the entering of the time of the salah and the continuity for the person who constantly remains in the state of impurity. Footnote number 31 reads, wudu or ritual bath should be performed after the entering of the salah's time for fard salah, or at a particular time for sunnah salah, example duha. That means the type of sunnah salah that has a specific time, and Allah knows best. Now, as was the style of the previous durus, after each section of the matan of the kitab, meaning the actual text of the book, we then also present you with the notes from a contemporary sharh of this book, a renowned and reliable sharh of this book, which is of course much more extensive than the core text of Safinat Al-Naja itself. And the one that we've chosen for this particular course is Nailur Raja. So what happens in the preparation for these classes is that I would read through the shuruh or the explanatory notes, which are again much more detailed, and then present the explanation within the teaching of the core text. But then I also provide you with those notes so as to have a reference to the explanation itself. So you had a verbal explanation, you had the core text as well, and then you have the notes that you can refer back to as you so desire. Now, of course, this won't be relevant to everyone. If it's a complete beginner, then you may find that the level of Arabic here is going to be somewhat more tedious to decipher than the core text, and that's fine. But it is important for us to have ways and means to constantly improve our understanding of Arabic, because this is the language through which we learn our Sharia, and Allah knows best. So there you can see there's about 4 pages of explanation for that section. And then we proceed to the next section of this dars, bi'idhnillah. And that reads as follows. فَصْلٌ فِي نَوَاقِضِ الْوُضُوءِ. The chapter regarding those nullifiers of ablution. So what does that mean, the nullifiers of ablution? This means that when you have ablution, there's certain acts that if you were to do them, you would no longer have ablution. So how we generally refer to this is those factors that breaks your wudu, right? So nawaqidul wudu, those things that break the wudu. Nawaqidul wudu'i, those things that break the wudu, arba'atu ashya'a, they are 4 things, 4 acts. Al-awwalu, the first, al-khariju min ahadi sabilain, that anything exits from the word kharaja, to exit. Al-khariju, that which exits, min ahadi, from one of as-sabilain, one of the 2 pathways. What does that mean? The 2 private parts. Min qubulin, whether the front private part, or duburin, or the rear private part. Rihun, whether it be a wind, or ghayruhu, or anything else. Illa al-mani, except for sperm, which in the Shafi'i school is a bit of an interesting exception to that rule, but we will explain that in greater detail as we proceed. Firstly, what we've learned so far from this chapter is, number one, there are 4 factors that breaks one's ablution. Now, this is another key in learning fiqh, right? When we initially learn fiqh, the tendency would be to ask questions about every individual possibility. So, for example, you would receive a question, Shaykh, does vomiting break the wudu? Does walking on the tiles with bare feet break the wudu? Does sweating break the wudu? Does smoking break the wudu? Does bleeding break the wudu? And so on and so forth. But the possibilities of questions in this regard are infinite, right? You literally need to go through every possible action to then try to determine an answer. The way to understand it through the study of sacred law is learn the arkan, learn the shurut, learn the sunan. What does not form part of those elements are automatically excluded, because our scholars, they've been very meticulous in the way they constructed their definitions and the parameters of these concepts. So if they say nawaqidul wudu'i arba'atu ashya, those factors which break the ablution are 4. This means that anything not included within these 4 factors, automatically you have the answer. Do they break the wudu? No, they do not. Why not? Because they are not one of the 4 factors within the Shafi'i school that breaks ablution. Now, there are some differences across the madhahib as to what exactly breaks the ablution. And that's fine, but that's not what we are speaking about right now. What we are speaking about is that as you learn, if you come across a section that says nawaqidul wudu'i arba'atu ashya, that those factors which nullify one's ablution are 4, then anything not included would naturally not nullify the ablution without exception. So that essentially answers an infinite number of possibilities thereafter. The first point, as we've just learned, is al-khariju min ahadis sabilain min qubulin aw duburin, anything that exits either the front or the rear private part. This is regardless of whether the individual in question is a male or female. And it is also regardless of the nature of that which exits the private part. So if it is a wind, if it is a liquid, if it is a solid, if it is a stone, if it's a worm, etc., all of that would break one's ablution. Another sort of a strange one or non-regular occurrence is, for example, a woman goes for an invasive test procedure where a gynecologist would need to internally examine the woman's private part. So in this case, they may enter some sort of instrument within her private part in order to do the examination. So something entering into the private part doesn't break the ablution, but that thing that enters is also naturally going to exit. So when it exits, then that becomes something that exits the private part. So as soon as there's something that exits the private part, this breaks the ablution. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. So from this point onwards, if you come across any scenario about something that exits the private part, then the conclusion for that is that the wudu of that individual would have been broken. The exception that is mentioned here, he says illa al-mani, except for sperm, is this is an exception that is unique to the Shafi'i school. So to explain this exception, let's look at the footnotes. Footnote number 32 says, or anything else, whether common or uncommon, such as a worm or stone, but not mani, not semen. An example of this, meaning an example of semen coming from the private part, yet not breaking the wudu, is someone who is firmly seated, right, who sleeps and has a wet dream, or someone who looks at something lustfully and sperm or sexual fluid are emitted. So that's an example of it. Yet still, despite that example, the truth of the matter is that this clause or this exception is somewhat extrinsic from the discussion itself. It has no real practical application in terms of ablution and ritualistic worship. So theoretically, in the Shafi'i school, when semen exits, right, then the exiting of semen itself is not a cause for breaking the wudu. Why not? Because the Shafi'i school looks at the evidence that Imam Shafi'i pointed us towards, which is that Allah Ta'ala, لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam, we had honored the human being. And as such, the human being comes from a very noble substance. So semen is not looked at in the Shafi'i school as being najasa. It is not looked at as something being impure. In fact, it is something that is looked at as the origin of life in a worldly sense. So the Shafi'i school gives a special ruling for that. But while the special ruling exists, in terms of practical application, the example that was given, somebody's sleeping, but they're sitting firmly on their backside on the ground, so that sleep would not nullify the wudu, as you'd come to discover in the second clause. Yet, they have a wet dream, so sperm exits. So you can argue that according to the Shafi'i school, this person still has wudu. And that would be true. The person still has wudu in a technical, theoretical sense. But what can they do with that wudu? Can they go and pray salah? No. Why not? Because they don't have a ghusl, right? Because the exiting of sperm automatically nullifies the ghusl. So without a ghusl, you cannot pray salah, because you need a ghusl as well as wudu. So in that sense, it's theoretical, but it's there nonetheless, and it's in our text. And I think it's significant because it demonstrates that Islamic law is not just about the letter of the law and the practical value, but also the spiritual foundation upon which it is based. That the laws are not just do this, don't do that, for the sake of saying do this and don't do that. But it takes its cue directly from the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the sunnah of his Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So I hope that suffices as an explanation for that. You don't have to worry too much about that condition. We move on to the second nullifier of wudu, and that is athani. Number 2, zawalul aql, the lapse of consciousness. Binawmin, either by way of sleep, or ghayrihi, or some other factor. إلا نوم قاعد ممكن مقعدته من الأرض, except for the sleep of one who sits firmly placed with their backside on the ground. So this factor of breaking the wudu, zawalul aql, a lapse in intellect, means that for whatever reason the person is not conscious, not completely conscious, to the point where the faculties of hearing and seeing and thinking consciously have been lifted. So somebody who faints, for example, somebody who falls into a deep trance all of a sudden and they just fall down, somebody who sleeps, right? Somebody who is under general anesthetic, mathalan. So these are all examples of somebody whose aql has been temporarily removed or suspended. The moment that happens, then automatically the person's wudu is nullified. Tamam? And this would require a renewal of ablution. However, there's an exception to that, right? And the exception is if you sleep or if you lose consciousness while being firmly seated on the ground, meaning that the person's backside, the gluteus maximus, the backside muscles, both cheeks, so to speak, are firmly placed on the ground, then that factor makes this clause a non-issue. So somebody who sleeps would normally break their wudu, but if they are sleeping upright so that the backside is firmly placed on the ground, then for as long as they are in that position, their wudu remains intact. If they were to lift one or both of the backside muscles from the ground, or fall over, for example, even for a moment, while being in an unconscious state, then that would immediately nullify the wudu. So notice, the law is not based on whether something exited from the private part or not, but rather it's based upon a situation where there is probability or possibility of something exiting. And if the person is in a state of sleep and they are firmly placed on the ground, right, where there's no movement, there's no lifting up of either side, then the probability of something having exited in that condition is so low that the law would state that person still has their ablution intact. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. So that was the second factor that nullifies the wudu, when the consciousness of a person is suspended for some reason or the other. We move on to the third cause of breaking one's wudu according to the Shafi'i school. الثالث التقاء, the meeting, basharatay, of the two skins, rajulin, of a man, wamra'atin, and a woman, kabiraini, who are adult, meaning they are not minors or prepubescent, ajnabiyaini, and they are strangers to one another, meaning they are of marriageable kin, that if they so wished they could marry each other, min ghayri ha'ilin, without any barrier between them. So how we normally express this in day-to-day language is a man touching a woman or a woman touching a man, right? But of course fiqh is more specific than that. So here it states very clearly, iltiqa'u basharatay, it must be the contact of skin on skin. So it's not, for example, you're standing in a line and you knock with your covered elbow or your covered shoulder, you knock onto a member of the opposite sex. That wouldn't break one's wudu because there's a barrier. It's not skin on skin contact. Or for example, touching the back of a nail or touching a tooth is not considered, or touching a strand of hair mathalan, these are not considered skin proper. So touching that wouldn't be considered the touching of skin on skin. So specifically it is touching skin on skin of a strange man and a strange woman who could potentially marry one another, and there's no mention of desire whatsoever. So this is any touch, right? أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاء is what Allah Ta'ala refers to in the Quran, that this is based upon. And of course other readings would read أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاء. So in the one context, or you touch the woman, would be interpreted as sexual touching, so the touching of the private parts. But then in a more general sense, another qira'ah reads أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاء, or you touch women, وَلَمْ يَجِدُوا مَاءً, and you do not find water, and إِلَى آخِرِ الْآيَةِ. So the touching of skin on skin, according to the Shafi'i school, between a non-mahram man and woman would break their ablution, regardless of whether the touch was deliberate or accidental, whether it was a touch based on desire or an innocent touch, so to speak. Now, of course, here is a point in which practically every Shafi'i follower would have heard some sort of difference of opinion or other opinion, because it's a popular mas'ala. It's something that affects people on a day-to-day basis, especially in relation to husbands and wives. So a husband and wife would come to hear that this breaks their wudu, so every time they touch one another, automatically the wudu is broken. So people look for different opinions and the like. So I'll quickly mention that yes, there are differences of opinion. The Hanafi school regards no touching of this nature except for absolute private part on private part touching to be a factor that nullifies the wudu. The Maliki and the Hanbali school regards this type of touching to break the wudu, but only if there's presence of desire. And the Maliki school has many distinctions as far as the different type of scenarios that could possibly come forth from this. So the most precautious view about whether this breaks the wudu or not is that of the Shafi'i school. The most relaxed view on this particular mas'ala is that of the Hanafi school. However, it is necessary for me to emphasize that these opinions are not just based on, oh, they felt this way and they felt that way and they wanted an easier way and they wanted to be difficult. No, not at all. The Shafi'i school takes its cue from the Quran, the verse that I mentioned, and that recitation of that particular verse that we mentioned. The rest of the madha'ib, they take the cue from other evidence, such as a hadith which mentions or appears to mention that the Prophet ﷺ had wudu, kissed one of his wives, then left and then prayed salah and did not perform wudu. And then you read such a hadith and immediately you think, well, okay, then this must mean that the Shafi'i madhab is wrong. But this would be an oversimplification of a very complex process. The hadith in question that people generally refer to is a hadith about which scholars had much difference of opinion in terms of its authenticity, where some scholars regarded it as reliable, while others, the likes of Imam al-Bukhari and Imam al-Tirmidhi, regarded it as unreliable. And so the Shafi'i school also regards it as an unreliable narration, and therefore they would not base their law upon that. There are other ahadith as well that give a similar type of impression, though less clear in terms of its wording, wherein the Shafi'i school would say that, look, there's no clear indication that this was a skin-on-skin contact. Now that's as far as I would take the discussion at this level, right? And then to say that what we've discussed here as far as point number 3 is concerned as to what breaks the wudu, that remains the mu'tamad or the relied upon view of the Shafi'i school, and there's no difference as far as what the mu'tamad is in this respect. So if you ask what is the Shafi'i ruling, this is the Shafi'i ruling. And if you ask what's the evidence is, I mentioned only the basic coverage of the evidence, but that would be the evidence. Then the next question, of course, comes about for Shafi'i scholars. I'm just going to preempt the question, well, can we then follow one of the other opinions that has been mentioned of the other madhahib? And the answer is yes. However, if you are going to follow a different opinion, then you need to ensure that you are not combining different opinions to the point where you end up with a type of ibadah that none of the scholars would agree as being valid. In other words, you need to avoid mixing and matching opinions where you end up with a bag of something that is not valid by the one party or the other party. So if you take some of the conditions of the Shafi'i school and some of the conditions of the Hanafi school and you put them together and you say, well, this is now how I consider what breaks the wudu and what doesn't, that would be problematic. So you have to be consistent in terms of your application. Now, again, this is a complex discussion that I'm, rattling off in a very speedily way because, we have objectives here and we need to make sure that we stick to those objectives. But for anyone interested in a more in-depth discussion of this nature or perhaps a more nuanced understanding of these differences, I would suggest one of two things. Number one, either you read a specific fatwa on the matter, and you'll find several on the Seekers Guidance Answer Service, that's seekersguidance.org, and you can research the answers there from the Shafi'i perspective, of course, to understand it there. And then number two, if you want an even more in-depth and nuanced understanding of what's happening here and why do you have such differences, then I would recommend that you take a course on Islamic legal theory to understand exactly how the law works. And currently we have several offerings of this nature on Seekers Guidance, including a course on the Waraqat of Imam al-Haramain by Shaykh Muhammad Ka, a course on the Lubb al-Usul of Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari by myself, as well as others in Arabic as well. So for those interested, please do refer to those courses. Now that was a long tangent on an important point because it's a point that often comes up. Now we need to proceed to the fourth point, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, which is massu qubulil adamiyyi aw حلقة دبره ببطن الراحة أو بطون الأصابع. The fourth factor which nullifies one's ablution according to the Shafi'i school is the touching of a human private part. So mas means touching, qubuli of the front private part, al-adami, a human front private part, أو حلقة دبره, or the anus, halaqa, the circle, duburihi, of his backside, so the anus, bibatani, with the insides, ar-rahati, of the palm, or butun al-asabi', or the insides of the fingers. So let's firstly deal with the initial stage, the touching of the front or rear human private part. Human, we're not referring to animals, we're not referring to anything that's not human. Front, of course, the front private part for a male is clear, and the front private part for a female is clear, so both is applicable. And then the specification of the anus as opposed to just saying the backside is because it's only in reference to the anus and not the entire muscle region. What type of touching? It is touching with the insides of the palm, right? Bi batni raha, or the insides of the fingers. To simplify this, if you place your two hands together in this manner, then those parts of the hands that touch, if those parts touch a human private part in the manner that was described, then that would be a cause to nullify one's ablution, and Allah knows best. Now, what's important at this point is, other than just to revise the points, right, which we will do now, is to also think about what is not being mentioned here. So, for example, there's no mention of touching najasa, touching urine, touching feces, etc., touching vomit or vomiting, swearing. So all those factors that are not mentioned here will not nullify the wudu, right? And initially that may come as a bit of a surprise. So you'll start thinking of scenarios, and there may be something that you've always thought, okay, this would nullify the ablution. But based on what you're learning here, you should be able to decipher that no, in fact, it is not the case, and Allah knows best. So let's do a quick revision of that, inshallah ta'ala. The factors that nullify the wudu are 4. Number 1, anything that exits from either the front or the rear private parts, whether wind or anything else, except semen. We've explained this. Number 2, loss of intellect through sleep or other causes, except sleep while firmly seated on the ground. We've explained that. Number 3, skin-to-skin contact between an adult, non-mahram, marriageable male and female without any barrier. We've explained that as well. And number 4, touching the private parts of a human with the palm or inner surface of the fingers. And then, of course, there are some footnotes there, which I've already kind of explained, so you have a reference to that. And then the text from Nailur Raja, the Sharh of Safinat Al-Naja, for your read, and your discretion to read as you so wish, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Of course, it's not meant to be read on screen, in case you were wondering. The idea is that students who register for the course, they receive these slides in the form of course notes that they can, refer back to whenever they so desire. And the other benefit, of course, of registering for the course, as opposed to just watching the material on social media or YouTube, is that you can systematically follow through with the course, lesson by lesson, as well as do self-assessments through multiple choice questions that would ensure that you've covered the basic understanding of a particular lesson before moving on to the next lesson, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So do register if you haven't already done so. The registration details would be on screen. It is seekersguidance.org. You find Hadrami Safinat Al-Naja 2024 under the live courses section, and you register for that. You'll then get access to the Moodle page, which is where the courses are hosted, and you can also interact with myself through the questions and answers forums for that particular course, inshallah. So once again, we've covered those lessons, those revision points. Then I've given you a table here that I've extracted. It's a useful table from another booklet, and I think that you may find it beneficial to have everything on one page, because it covers as you can see, it covers the shurut, and it covers the furud or the arkan, and it covers the sunan as well. And we've dealt with the other matters as well. We've dealt with the furud and the sunan, and of course now we've added the shurut into that equation also. Now we go on to the next section, inshallah ta'ala. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Faslun fima yahrumu ala al-muhdith. What is haram? What is prohibited? Ala al-muhdith, for a person in a state of non-wudu. These are important terms. I hope everybody is paying attention to the terminology. Mustalahat, or technical terms, are essential to understand a science thoroughly. So a term such as haram, right? By now you should have understood that term instantly, because it was covered in, I think, the first or the second lesson. When we say something is sunnah, by now you should understand it thoroughly. It is essential to learn at the basic level, to learn the fundamental terms as you proceed, because they will only increase, and they will only become sort of more relied upon. And eventually we will move to a point where we take it for granted that you would understand what is a muhdith, what is hadath, what is haram, and so forth. So do due diligence, inshallah ta'ala, as far as learning and memorizing these terms, and may Allah ta'ala benefit us all with beneficial knowledge. So this chapter deals with what is haram, what is prohibited for a muhdith. What's a muhdith? A person in a state of hadath. What is a state of hadath? You get two types of hadath, the minor hadath and the major hadath. Hadath, essentially, when you use it as is, refers to a person who doesn't have wudu. So that's the minor state. And a person in a major state of hadath, al-hadathul akbar, that would be a person who does not have a ghusl. So what is haram for a person in a state of hadath? Man intaqada wudu'uhu, whoever the ablution has broken, haruma alayhi, becomes haram upon them, becomes prohibited for them, arba'atu ashya'a, four things. As-salatu, pray, wat-tawafu, circumambulation of the Kaaba, wa massul mushafi, touching a copy of the Quran, wa hamluhu, and carrying a copy of the Quran. These are the four elements that are prohibited for a person without wudu. Right? Four things are prohibited: to pray salah, to make tawaf around the Kaaba, to touch a copy of the Quran, and to carry a copy of the Quran. Now, the salah and the tawaf is straightforward. You cannot have salah without wudu, you cannot have tawaf without wudu. The touching of the mushaf has some contemporary application, so we'll just briefly run through that. When we come across the term mushaf in Arabic, it refers to a copy of the Quran. So in English, people generally say, pass me the Quran, or I'm reading, this is my Quran, and so forth. It's a bit of a technicality, but the Quran proper is the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is the uncreated speech of Allah. So a mushaf is a representation of that speech, but it isn't the actual Quran, right? It isn't the Quran proper, because the mushaf is something that is printed, it has a finite lifetime, whereas the Quran is infinite. It has no beginning and no end, so there's a technicality there. Secondly, when we speak about touching the mushaf, it is a reference to touching a book in which the overwhelming majority of what is written therein is in fact Quran writing, Quran speech, the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If it is not, in other words, if it's mixed with something else, to the point where more than 50% of the contents of that book is non-Quran, then that's no longer referred to as a mushaf, right? It would be referred to as something else. An example of this would often be translation Qur'ans. So a translation Qur'an without any Arabic in there is not considered a mushaf. It's considered a translation of a mushaf. A translation Qur'an that has the words in Arabic as well as the translation would naturally, being a translation, it would naturally have more non-Arabic words than Arabic words, right? Because it would require footnotes and explanatory notes and brackets and the like. So the ruling is to touch a translation Quran. If the non-Quranic parts, the translated parts, are more than the Arabic parts, then you would not need ablution to touch that particular book, though scholars would still say don't touch the Arabic words themselves without ablution. So if that is the case for a translation Quran, the same thing would apply to any other book in which words of the Quran are written, like a book of tafsir, for example. A book of tafsir, the shortest, the most concise of which would probably be al-Jalalain, Tafsir al-Jalalain of Jalaluddin al-Mahalli and Jalaluddin al-Suyuti rahimahumullah ta'ala, hence Jalalain. That book is, it's practically like one word for every Arabic word of the Quran, but also slightly more. So even that is an example of a book that you do not need wudu to touch it. Other tafasir, a fortiori, even more so, because you're going to have far more non-Quranic words, in other words, non-divine words, than the divine speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that covers what to touch and what not to touch, and what to carry and what not to carry without wudu. Then the other question that obviously comes up at this point is, what about electronic devices such as a smartphone and the like? So a typical smartphone, like right here, this is a smartphone. On the smartphone, you're going to have applications. One application is going to be the Quran. On a Muslim's phone, you're probably going to have a Quran app. Whether this is something that Muslims should engage in or not, that's a different discussion. However, if you have a Quran app on your phone, does that mean you cannot touch your phone without wudu? The answer is, well, there are different opinions in this regard, but the answer of the scholars that have given answers for the Shafi school in this regard, and you can find these answers on Seeker's Guidance Answer Service, is that a phone is not a mushaf, right? The function of the phone, the contents of the phone is overwhelmingly other than the mushaf. It is only when you open up the Quran app that the screen is covered by the words of the Quran, in which case you still don't need wudu to touch it, because it's still not a mushaf. It's just reflecting that image of one page of the mushaf at that moment. But overwhelmingly, it's still not a mushaf. Still then, as the recommendation went previously, to not touch the Arabic words without ablution is the safest opinion to follow in that regard. So I would recommend that we follow that as well. The other concepts are clear, so we can proceed inshallah. And if you cannot touch it, then even more so you shouldn't be carrying it. What is the ruling in relation to carrying the mushaf with some cover on it? And then you say, well, I'm touching the cover of the mushaf and not the mushaf itself. Still, that cover becomes part of the mushaf, so you should avoid touching that also. And Allah knows best. So if that is the case with a person in a state of non-wudu, then we proceed to the next phase. وَيَحْرُمُ is haram عَلَى الْجُنُبِ, upon a person in a state of major ritual impurity. Junub refers to a state of janaba. That would be a state of I'm not sure about this translation, but I saw sexual defilement. I'm not sure about that, right? So essentially it means that a person had ejaculated, so they need a ghusl, and they are referred to as being in a state of janaba, right? And as an individual, they'd be called a junub. So what is haram upon a person in a state of janaba? Sittatu ashya, there are 6 factors that are haram, right? The same 4 that applied previously and an additional 2. What were the first 4? As-salatu, pray, wa-tawafu, circumambulation of the Kaaba. Notice also, by the way, that there's a specific mention of circumambulation of the Kaaba and not sa'i, right? Tawaf, you require ghusl, you require wudu. For sa'i, for sa'i you do not require ablution or ghusl. So that's a discussion that you deal with in Hajj, but it's an important point to mention here as well. Then, وَمَسْحُ الْمُصْحَفِ, touching of the mushaf, we mentioned that as well. وَحَمْلُهُ, carrying the mushaf. Then the additional points that were not mentioned previously, meaning you could do this without wudu, but you cannot do this without a ghusl. وَاللُّبْثُ فِي الْمَسْجِدِ, to remain in the mosque. وَقِرَاءَةُ الْقُرْآنِ, and to read the Quran. Now, the words are chosen quite carefully, so do take note of them. لُبْثُ فِي الْمَسْجِدِ, to remain in the mosque, as opposed to simply passing through the mosque. Passing through the mosque, simply entering and going through the other side, that's permitted. But to remain in the masjid, so to go inside and actually pause there, to remain in the masjid, that would not be permitted for a person in a state of non-ghusl. And then qira'atul Quran. So we already covered touching the Quran, holding the Quran, carrying the Quran. But here, in addition to not being able to touch it, when you don't have a state of ghusl, then to recite the Quran would also be haram. It would also be prohibited according to the Shafi'i school. Now, as far as the questions around this is concerned, I'm not going to get into the detail. Our time has almost run out here. But anybody interested to know what should be done if there's a haja, if there's a need to touch the Quran, to recite the Quran, etc., but you do not have a ghusl, you do not have wudu, for example, a hafiz, a student of deen and the like, then there are fatwa written in relation to this issue on the Seeker's Guidance Answer Service that I'm going to refer you to check out over there. I think I've composed some of them myself for the Shafi'i school, if I recall correctly. But be that as it may, this is the mu'tamad view. So this is the default for Shafi'i students and Shafi'i scholars. and you should follow through with this one accordingly. If there's a haja for a different opinion, you have any, there are some differences, there is some leeway, though we should follow such opinions with a state of caution, with a state of awareness of the details therein, as opposed to just following. The idea of, okay, that's another topic altogether, but you shouldn't just go through fiqh and try to find what's the easiest here, what's the easiest there. That is also unlawful, right? So you shouldn't do what we may refer to as fatwa shopping to consistently find the easiest approach. That's not allowed, and Allah knows best. Then the third element to this is, so we've spoken about no wudu, no ghusl, but what about hayd? What about menstruation? وَيَحْرُمُ بِالْحَيْض, what is haram with menstruation, عَشَرَةُ أَشْيَاء, are 10 factors. Again, the first 4 that applied to non-wudu, salah, tawaf, massul mushafi, hamluhu, as well as the additional 2 that apply to non-ghusl, lubthu fil masjid, to remain in the mosque, qira'atul Quran, to recite the Quran. Now the additional factors, in other words, what is also haram for a woman in a state of menstruation or postnatal bleeding, was sawmu, fasting, wa talaqu, divorce. I'm going to mention something about this in a moment. Wal mururu fil masjid, to pass through the mosque, in khafat talwithahu, if she fears that she will contaminate or stain the mosque. Wal istimta'u, as well as foreplay, bima bayna surrati wa rukbati, in the area between the navel and the knees. So there we've explained the first 6. Now we've added certain factors to that. The first factor we added was fasting. Of course, we know that a lady in a state of menstruation or postnatal bleeding should not fast. It is haram for her to fast. By not fasting, she is obeying the law of Allah Ta'ala in this regard. The second point that we added here was talaq. So at first glance, this may seem strange. So are we saying that it is haram for her to talaq? No, it is haram for her to be divorced in a state of hayd. Now we deal with this in Kitabu Talaq, but it is mentioned here, so it would be good to just allude to this. For a husband to divorce his wife, there's different categories of the way he can divorce his wife. What concerns us here is that it is haram for a husband to divorce his wife while she is in a state of hayd. And there's evidence for this from the Sharia. What he should do is wait for her hayd to stop and then divorce her in a clean period wherein he has not had intimate relations with her. That would be a divorce free of any problems. If he does divorce her while she is in a state of hayd or in a clean period wherein they had sexual relations, the talaq is nonetheless valid. So he would be sinful for having divorced her in such a time, but the divorce would still be valid, and that's an important point here. So don't confuse the two. Then we've added. So initially, we said a person who needs a ghusl because they are junub. We said that they cannot remain in the mosque, but they can pass through. The same thing applies for a lady with a hayd, but she cannot pass through the mosque if there's a fear that she will contaminate the mosque or that her blood would reach the mosque. Now, of course, in contemporary application, sanitary measures for menstruation and the like are far more sophisticated than they've been in the past. But regardless, there may still be a situation in which a woman has perhaps just experienced a hayd, and as a sort of an emergency, she needs to pass through the mosque to get to the other side. If there's fear that she will contaminate the mosque, then she may not pass through. Otherwise, she may pass through as mentioned. And then finally, because relations between a husband and a wife during hayd, right, penetrative intercourse would be haram. But what is still permitted is acts of foreplay between a husband and a wife. However, what should be avoided is foreplay that involves the area where the hayd is actually present. As Allah says in the Quran, فَاعْتَزِلُوا النِّسَاءَ فِي الْمَحِيضِ, avoid your wives, avoid going to your partners during the state of hayd, and Allah knows best. So that covers what is haram. Now, I've included the translation again. There's no need for us to go through it because in and of itself, it's actually a revision. The nice part about this section is that it has a logical layout. There are 4 factors that are haram for a person without wudu. You add 2, then there are the 6 factors that are haram for a person who doesn't have a ghusl after janaba. And then you add another 4 for the person who is in a state of menstruation. And then you understand exactly what is permissible and what is not permissible for a person in these various states of impurity. Excuse me. And then another consideration is what we said earlier. Earlier on we said, as you learn fiqh, you come across a list, right? These are the arkan, these are the shurut, these are the sunan. These are the factors that would nullify, right? The mubtilat, the nullifiers. These are the actions that are haram upon, a person in this condition. When you learn such a list, there's application to it. It's not only the application of what is mentioned, but it is also the non-application of what is not mentioned. So there are many misconceptions about matters of sacred law. For example, I've heard of many misconceptions about a person performing the ghusl of a mayyit. Can a woman in a state of haid perform the ghusl of a mayyit? Now, if you go through the list of what is haram for a person in a state of haid, you would notice that there's no mention of it is haram for her to perform the ghusl on a mayyita or on a mayyit. The fact that it is not mentioned, it's not part of this comprehensive list, means that it is not haram. So therefore, you can say it is permissible for a woman who is in a state of haid to participate in the ghusl, the washing of a deceased body. And this structured methodology of fiqh is not haphazard. It is very systematic and deliberately so as to make learning for us as students of deen, students of Islam, more accessible and easier to follow, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So to conclude, there we have the translation of that section. There's a footnote, and I've been through this footnote in terms of the application. There's an extra note here about permissibility of carrying the Quran in baggage that you can read through there. Then the notes from Nailur Raja, right, for the students who registered, these will form part of your reading notes, and a comprehensive list of al-Hadath al-Asghar, right, the minor form of impurity, the causes of the minor form, which we've covered, the 4 causes of the minor form. This is an exception, it's not one of the causes, right, over here. And then what is haram in a state of non-wudu. And then, of course, on top of that 4, you add another 2 for the state of janaba, and you add another 4 for the state of hayd. I did silence my phone. I have no idea why it's still coming through on my iPad. Tamam, we've completed that now, alhamdulillah. Number 1 was the 10 conditions of ablution. That was the first factor we've covered. Number 2 was the 4 nullifiers of ablution, what breaks the wudu. And finally, we dealt with all the forbidden actions of a person in a state of impurity, whether that be minor impurity or major impurity, and the different forms of that. I'll leave you with a question. Does vomiting break one's ablution according to the Shafi'i school? Does vomiting break one's ablution according to the Shafi'i school? Of course, you should be able to answer this question by now. And to test your knowledge further, don't forget, inshallah ta'ala, to take the quizzes that form part of your course registration, all free of charge, on seekersguidance.org. Until next time, inshallah ta'ala, jazakumullahu khairan for joining me. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad, subhanallahi wa bihamdi, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.